a team of scientists went to Roanoke Island to kill a ghost story. They brought the most advanced tools of the 21st century to debunk a 400-year-old myth. But what happens when science doesn't erase the legend, but proves it? They searched for answers in the soil, but the final, irrefutable proof wasn't buried at all. It was alive, hidden in the bloodline of a man who knew the secret all along. How can a story be a ghost story if no one ever died? The road to Roanoke Island is a narrow ribbon of asphalt cutting through a world of green. Ancient oaks, draped in Spanish moss, lean over the road, their branches forming a dappled tunnel that flickers with sunlight. It feels less like a drive and more like a slow immersion into the past. Inside the climate-controlled quiet of the university research van, Dr. Alistair Finch was insulated from all of it. For him, the past wasn't in the looming trees or the humid, salty air. It was in the data scrolling across his widescreen monitor. Alistair, a man in his 40s, with the sharp, focused eyes of someone who prefers numbers to people, traced a line on a topographical map. "The mistake people make," he said, his voice a calm, confident baritone, "is they start with the mystery." He was speaking to a small camera mounted on the dashboard, a silent observer for the documentary crew funding part of his expedition. They start with the spooky story, 115 men, women, and children vanishing into thin air, leaving behind a single cryptic word. It's dramatic. It makes for great television. He gave a wry, almost imperceptible smile. But it's terrible archaeology. You don't start with the mystery, you start with the reality. You start with the soil. Across from him, his graduate student, Lena Petrova, meticulously calibrated the ground-penetrating radar unit. She was 25, fiercely intelligent, and possessed a skepticism so profound it made Alistair's pragmatism look like romantic idealism. She didn't believe in ghosts, gods, or even statistical outliers. She believed in repeatable results. "The reality," Alistair continued, gesturing to the screen, "is that the 1587 colony arrived at the worst possible time. Dendrochronology tree ring data shows the onset of the most extreme drought in 800 years. Their crops would have failed almost immediately. The soil stratigraphy tells a story not of a paranormal event, but of a desperate struggle for survival." He leaned forwards, his passion for the subject momentarily overriding his composed demeanor. "So the question isn't, did they vanish? The question is, where did they go? And the most logical answer has been sitting there for 400 years. They went to Croatoan Island, modern-day Hatteras. They sought help from the native population. This isn't a story of disappearance. It is a story of assimilation. My goal here is not to solve a ghost story. It is to find the physical evidence, post holes, pottery, trash pits that proves it." He sat back, his point made. The ghost story was dead. The data was everything. The van pulled into the parking lot of the Fort Raleigh National Historic Site, the reconstructed location of the original settlement. Alistair stepped out into the thick, heavy air and immediately ignored the neatly constructed palisades and the quaint period-appropriate cabins. They were tourist fiction, an approximation. He was interested in the truth etched into the landscape itself. "Look at the topography, Lena," he said, his eyes scanning the terrain. "High ground here, clear line of sight to the sound, proximity to a freshwater source over there. This is a defensible, logical position." He was deconstructing the myth, reassembling it as a series of logistical choices made by desperate people. A short distance away, a tour guide was doing the opposite. He stood before a small group of tourists, his voice booming with theatrical gravity. And when Governor John White finally returned, he found the settlement empty, dismantled. No sign of a struggle, no bodies, only that one chilling word, carved into the palisade post, Croatoan. Alistair couldn't help but scoff quietly. He saw a man leaning against a massive ancient oak tree at the edge of the tour group. The man was older, perhaps in his 60s, with dark, watchful eyes and a face that seemed to carry the history of the land in its lines. He was clearly of Native American descent, and he observed the tour guide's performance with a quiet, unreadable intensity. For a moment, his eyes left the guide and met Alistair's. It was a brief, silent exchange, a glance that held the weight of 4 centuries of conflicting narratives: the pragmatist and the patriarch, the man with the machines, and the man with the memory of the place. Then the moment passed. The man looked away, and Alistair turned his attention back to the soil beneath his feet. The real work began in an open field, a patch of unassuming grass a quarter-mile from the tourist trail. The grid was laid out in neat white lines. Lena began her slow, methodical walk, pushing the GPR unit like a futuristic lawnmower. The rhythmic beeping was the only sound besides the distant drone of cicadas. Alistair watched the data feed on a ruggedized tablet, his face a mask of concentration. He saw the world in layers, scrolling down the screen: topsoil, clay, sand, each line a sentence in the long story of the Earth. His satellite phone buzzed. He answered it, and the polished, authoritative face of Dr. Evelyn Reed, his department head, appeared on the screen. "Alistair," she began, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth. "Status report. We've begun the survey, Evelyn. Grid Alpha is underway." "Alpha," she said, a perfectly sculpted eyebrow raised in disapproval. "That says well north of the primary settlement area." "The accepted hypothesis, Alistair, the one our grant is predicated on, is that any satellite structures would be south, towards the Sound. The topography suggests this area would be better for a winter camp," Alistair countered, keeping his voice even. "It's more sheltered from the wind." "Dozens of teams have surveyed that island looking for your winter camp," she replied, her tone dripping with condescension. "They've found nothing but sand and disappointment. I trust you are not letting the local color cloud your judgment. Stick to the established parameters. Confirm the assimilation theory. That's your brief. Don't go chasing phantoms." The call ended, leaving Alistair staring at his own reflection in the blank screen. The pressure wasn't just to find evidence, but to find the right evidence. He put the phone away, his jaw tight. He trusted the data, not accepted theories. The data would lead him to the truth, wherever it was. He turned his attention back to Lena and the GPR feed. For hours, the results were predictable. The layers of soil scrolled by in perfect, undisturbed lines. Topsoil, sand, clay, history undisturbed. Then it happened. The GPR unit emitted a sharp, erratic series of beeps. Lena stopped, thinking it was a malfunction. She checked the connections, tapped the casing. "Getting some interference, Alistair." Alistair was already walking towards her, his eyes locked on the tablet. "It's not interference." There, on the screen, beneath the clean, predictable lines of geological time, was an impossibility, a dense, geometric shape, a perfect right angle. Then another. It was a collection of shapes too regular, too deliberate to be a rock formation. It was a structure, buried deep in the earth, and it wasn't supposed to be there. It was in the wrong place, contradicting every historical map of the settlement. Alistair felt a surge of adrenaline, a jolt of pure, unadulterated discovery that was the entire reason he did what he did. His detached, academic demeanor dissolved, replaced by an intense, almost predatory curiosity. The ghost story was dead, he had told himself. But here, on his screen, was a ghost in the machine. "Lena," he said, his voice low and urgent, "mark the coordinates. Mark them right now, and run a full cross-section scan. I want to see exactly what we were looking at." The mystery he had so confidently dismissed had just reached out from beneath the earth and pulled him in. The hum of the Van-S servers was the only sound, a stark contrast to the frantic beeping that had shattered the afternoon's quiet. On the main monitor, the Anomaly glowed in false color, a geometric ghost haunting the digital layers of soil. It was undeniably man-made. The cross-section scan revealed a series of distinct, regularly spaced post holes and a heavily compacted floor, the unmistakable signature of a large building. "It can't be," Lena said, her voice a low murmur. She zoomed in, her skepticism a tangible force in the small space. "The construction style is all wrong. The post holes are too large for wattle and daub, and the footprint, Alistair, this building would have been 3 times the size of the colonists' largest structure." She shook her head, running a dozen logical dismissals. "It has to be a later structure, a colonial-era barn, a plantation outbuilding. Some farmer who didn't make it onto the official maps." Alistair didn't take his eyes off the screen. "Look at the depth," he said quietly. He pointed to the faint line indicating the topsoil layer from the late 16th century, a layer he had verified with core samples weeks ago. It's sitting right on the Elizabethan-era strata. The depth is perfect. The time period is perfect. He zoomed out, viewing the entire ghostly outline. "It's from their time, Lena, but it wasn't built by them." A heavy silence fell between them. The data on the screen was a direct contradiction. It was a fact that fit no theory. It was an answer to a question no one had ever thought to ask. Lena, for the first time, seemed to be at a loss for a counter-argument. The data was the data. "So what do we do?" she finally asked. Alistair leaned back, the weight of the discovery and its implications settling on him. "We do this by the book," he said, his voice firm with decision. "We log the finding, we file a formal request with the university and the Park Service, and we get a permit to sink a small exploratory test pit. We need to put our hands on it. We need to see what it's made of." The decision was made. He would have to call Evelyn Reed. The wait for bureaucracy to grind into motion was agonizing. For 2 days, Alistair and Lena were archaeologists without a site, scholars in limbo. They found themselves in a local diner, the kind of place with faded vinyl booths and a thick smell of coffee and fried bacon. As they picked at their food, the man from the historic site, the quiet observer from under the oak tree, approached their table. It was Samuel Blackwood. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, holding a coffee mug in his weathered hands. "Dr. Finch," he said, his voice calm and even. It wasn't a question. Alistair looked up, surprised. "Yes, I am sorry. Have we met?" Samuel gave a slight shake of his head. "I see your van, your machines. I was wondering, what are they listening for?" Alistair, determined to be polite, gave him the simplified layman-esque explanation. "It's SES ground-penetrating radar. It sends radio waves into the earth and reads the echo. It lets us see different layers of soil, rock, anything that might be buried, without having to dig." Samuel nodded slowly, considering this. "So, you listen to the ground." He took a slow sip of his coffee. "Sometimes the ground doesn't talk. Sometimes the story isn't tea in the dirt. You have to listen to the blood." Alistair managed a thin academic smile. "The blood? My people, the Lumbee, have stories," Samuel said, his eyes distant, as if reading from a text only he could see. "The stories say our ancestors, who lived on the coast, did not find an empty village. They did not find ghosts. They found a people whose spirits were broken by hunger and fear. They were a tribe with pale skin and strange words, and they were dying. So my ancestors gave them a choice. They could keep their names and die in that place, or they could shed their old skins, take a new name, and live." He looked directly at Alistair. "They welcomed a new tribe, born from the old. That's our story." Alistair was silent for a moment, unsure how to respond to such a deeply held piece of lore. "That's a fascinating piece of folklore, Mr. Blackwood. Thank you for sharing it." He said the word folklore with the careful, gentle condescension of a scientist categorizing a specimen. He filed it away, a cultural curiosity, and returned to his cold coffee. The call to Dr. Reed was made from the van, the GPR anomaly displayed prominently on the monitor behind Alistair. When her face appeared, her expression was already one of profound irritation. Alistair got straight to the point, formally requesting permission for the exploratory dig and presenting the GPR data as his justification. Reed stared at the image, her lips thinning into a hard line. "Absolutely not," she said. her voice dangerously quiet. "Evelyn, the data is unambiguous," Alistair argued, trying to keep his composure. "It is a significant structure from the correct period in a previously unsurveyed location. We have a professional obligation to investigate." Her quiet tone vanished, replaced by a flash of fury. "You have an obligation to adhere to the parameters of your grant. Your job is to find evidence of assimilation on Hatteras Island, not to go chasing shadows in some random field because of a glitch on your screen." "It is not a glitch. I will not have this project, my project, derailed by your indulgence in speculative archaeology," she cut in, her voice rising. "You are a historian, Alistair, not a treasure hunter. You are to delete that data and get back to the established survey grids. If I get one report, one whisper, that you have put a spade in the ground at that site without my express written permission, I will personally see to it that your funding is revoked and a formal letter of censure is placed in your permanent file. Is that understood?" The screen went blank before he could answer. Alistair sat in the ringing silence, the threat hanging in the air. He was trapped. The data on his screen screamed that the truth was just a few feet beneath the grass, while the gatekeeper of his career had just slammed the door, locked it, and thrown away the key. He had a choice: abandon the single most important discovery of his life, or risk everything for it. Night fell on Roanoke Island. Under the faint light of a crescent moon, two figures moved through the tall grass of the survey field, carrying shovels and portable work lights. The decision Alistair had made was a heavy one. Every scrape of the shovel in the damp earth felt like a blow against his own career. Lena worked beside him, her earlier skepticism replaced by a grim, nervous determination. This was her career too, and he knew it. For hours, they dug, carefully removing the sod and setting it aside, then working their way down through the layers of topsoil and sand. The air was thick with the smell of earth and the sound of their own breathing. It was a violation, an act of rebellion. Then, at a depth of nearly 4 feet, Alistair's trowel hit something that wasn't soil or rock. It made a dull, resonant thud. He stopped, his heart pounding. He looked at Lena, whose eyes were wide in the harsh glare of the work light. Slowly, painstakingly, they knelt and began to brush away the soil with their hands. The dirt was cool and loose. What emerged from it was not the splintered wood of an English post or the rough brick of a foundation. It was stone, smooth, dark, and cool to the touch. As they cleared more soil, they revealed not a block, but a curved edge. It was a disc, massive and perfectly round, and it was covered in carvings. Alistair traced them with his finger. They were symbols, deeply incised, forming intricate patterns that seemed to swirl toward the center. They were not English letters. They were not the pictographs of the Algonquian tribes. They were something else entirely, something ancient and utterly alien. The discovery was a bolt of lightning. It was electrifying and terrifying in equal measure. The anomaly was real. The risk had paid off, but it shattered every preconceived notion he'd had. This stone, buried in the Virginia soil for 400 years, didn't belong to the story of the English. It didn't belong to the story of the natives. It belonged to a history no one knew existed. The frantic energy of the discovery had curdled into the quiet hum of failure. Back in the van, under the harsh blue light of the monitors, Alistair and Lena threw everything they had at the symbols from the stone disc. High-resolution photos were cross-referenced against every known database. The archives of the British Museum, the Smithsonian's Library of Native American Iconography, petroglyph databases from across the continent, even obscure catalogues of Viking runes and forgotten Celtic scripts. Nothing. Not a single match. The symbols existed outside of recorded history, a language with no Rosetta Stone. Lena paced the narrow confines of the van, her scientific composure completely gone, replaced by a raw, nervous energy. "This is insane, Alistair. We have to report this. This is bigger than us, bigger than Reed S. Grant." an unclassified pre-Columbian artifact with a completely unknown writing system. This could redefine the entire field. "And what do you think will happen the moment we report it?" Alistair shot back, his voice tight with frustration. He gestured at the screen. "Reed will swoop in with her own team, classify this as a site of interest, wrap it in a mile of red tape, and our disk will end up in a university basement, labeled Anomalous Find, Origin Unknown. She won't try to understand it, she'll bury it. It contradicts the narrative, so it has to be contained. So we just sit on it. On this." Lena S.'s voice was incredulous. Alistair stared at the alien symbols. His methods, his databases, the entire structured world of scientific archaeology had failed him. The data was a dead end. For the first time in his professional life, he was admitting defeat. His mind, grasping for any new variable, kept returning to the quiet words spoken in the diner. "Sometimes you have to listen to the blood." He had dismissed it as poetry, charming folklore from a man steeped in local myth. But the myths were all he had left. What if the story of a new tribe, shed from a different skin, wasn't a metaphor? What if it was a literal historical account, passed down not in writing, but in memory? It was an unscientific, untestable, absurd leap of faith, and it was the only path he had left. The next morning, Alistair drove to a modest, well-kept house on the mainland, nestled among tall pines. Samuel Blackwood was on his front porch, carving a small, intricate figure of a bird from a piece of wood. He looked up as Alistair S. Van pulled in, his hands never ceasing their work. He showed no surprise, as if he had been expecting him all along. Alistair walked up the steps, humbled. The confident professor stripped away, leaving only a man with a question he couldn't answer. He didn't offer a preamble. He simply held out his tablet, displaying a high-resolution photograph of the stone disk, its strange symbols glowing on the screen. "Mr. Blackwood," Alistair said, his voice quiet, "have you ever seen anything like this?" Samuel put down his carving and took the tablet. He held it with a surprising gentleness, his calloused fingers tracing the air just above the screen. He studied the symbols for a long time, his brow furrowed, not in confusion, but in deep concentration. Finally, he shook his head slowly. "No, not these marks." Alistair S.'s shoulders slumped. It had been a desperate, foolish hope. "But," Samuel continued, his eyes still fixed on the image, "I have seen this kind of work before. The way the lines are cut, the way the story flows. This is a story told by two mouths. One hand cut these lines with the memory of his own people. The other cut them with the memory of a foreign land. This stone speaks with two voices at once." He looked up, his gaze steady and profound. "This is a story of a beginning, Dr. Finch, not an ending." He handed the tablet back. "I will help you read it, but you have to agree to listen to the whole story, not just the pieces that fit inside your machines." Alistair, out of options and faced with a wisdom his science couldn't quantify, simply nodded. "I'll listen." What followed was a different kind of archaeology. The sterile quiet of the lab was replaced by the dusty silence of county archives and the crackle of old audio cassettes. Samuel Blackwood became Alistair S. guide through a history that was never written down. He led him to oral history recordings from the 1930s, where Lumbee elders recounted stories passed down for generations, stories of a sudden influx of pale-skinned people, of sharing food and knowledge, of a terrible sickness and a great dying. While Samuel navigated the world of memory, Alistair navigated the world of data. In the van at night, he cross-referenced the folkloric accounts with hard science, the stories of a great blight that withered the crops of both native and Englishmen, prompted him to pull up meteorological records and dendrochronology charts from the 1580s. The data was stark. The period between 1587 and 1590 wasn't just a drought. It was the most severe drought the region had seen in 800 years. The colonists hadn't just faced hardship. They had landed in the middle of a generation-defining climate catastrophe. The folklore and the science were telling the exact same story of mass starvation. Two different languages describing the same apocalypse. Armed with this new synthesized understanding, they returned to the site. Alistair knew where to dig now. Samuel's knowledge of the land, of how his ancestors would have chosen a site for a sacred ceremony, combined with Alistair's GPR data, pointed to a larger area around the stone disk. They expanded the excavation, and the true nature of the site was revealed. It wasn't a building. There were no walls, no domestic hearth. It was a vast open-air ritual space. The stone disk lay at its absolute center, and arranged in a wide circle around it was a collection of artifacts that made Alistair's breath catch in his throat. It was a deliberate, ceremonial burial of two separate cultures. On one side of the circle were dozens of English items: white clay pipe stems, snapped in half, metal buttons, cut from their coats, shards of Staffordshire pottery, deliberately shattered. On the other side were native offerings, carefully arranged piles of oyster shell beads, fire-cracked animal bones from a great feast, and carved wooden figures, now little more than dark stains in the soil. It was a profound act of surrender. Two peoples, facing annihilation, had met in this spot and ceremonially discarded the totems of their old lives. As Alistair stood in stunned silence, Lena called out from the edge of the pit. She had been running soil samples through her portable mass spectrometer. "Alistair, you need to see this." Her voice was trembling. "The carbon and phosphate levels are off the charts, consistent with a massive fire and decaying organic matter. But the pollen counted as almost exclusively Yopon holly." Alistair knew what that meant. Yopon holly, the source of the black drink, was used by the coastal tribes in their most sacred purification rituals. It was a plant of healing, of spiritual rebirth. He looked around at the broken pipes and the sacred shells, at the ghosts of two cultures colliding in a moment of ultimate desperation. The entire mystery of the lost colony was turned on its head. The question was never, where did they go? He stared at the ceremonial circle, the truth hitting him with the force of a physical blow. The question was, what desperate act did they perform before they left? This wasn't a gravesite. This was a chrysalis. The sunlight felt different the next day, the air charged with the energy of revelation. But the quiet triumph was short-lived. A convoy of 3 black sedans churned up the dirt road, parking with an air of official severity. Dr. Evelyn Reed emerged from the lead car, flanked by 2 stern-faced university administrators. Someone had made a call. She strode to the edge of the excavation pit, her face a mask of cold fury. But as she looked down upon the scene, the great stone disk, the carefully arranged circle of English and native artifacts, her anger faltered, replaced by a flicker of stunned, momentary silence. Her mind, so used to neat categories and established theories, struggled to process the impossible tableau before her. The silence lasted only a second. Then, her institutional programming rebooted, and her expression hardened into one of absolute control. "This site is now under the direct authority of the university," she announced, her voice ringing with command. "All unauthorized personnel will vacate the premises immediately." "Your access is revoked, Dr. Finch." Alistair stared at her, aghast. "Evelyn, you see what this is? This isn't a settlement. It is a ceremony. This changes everything." Reed let out a short, incredulous laugh. "What I see," she said, her voice dripping with scorn as she gestured at the sacred circle, "is a trash pit with mixed contaminants. A century of overlapping land use. You've let this island's romantic fantasies rot your methodology. You're done here, Alistair." She turned to the administrators. "Secure the site. I don't want anyone near it." She had seen the truth for a fleeting moment, and her immediate visceral reaction was to bury it under the full weight of her authority. Exiled. They were barred from their own discovery, locked out of the very ground that held the answer. The three of them, Alistair, Lena, and Samuel, retreated to the claustrophobic confines of the research van, the only territory they had left. An atmosphere of furious, desperate energy filled the space. They had the data, they had managed to collect the photos, the GPR scans, and most importantly, the soil samples Lena had frantically bagged before they were forced out. "If she thinks this is over, she is an idiot," Lena muttered, her hands flying across the keyboard of the DNA sequencer. "I got enough soil from the core of the ritual site. If there is human DNA in there, this little machine will find it." She worked with a newfound ferocity, her skepticism now aimed squarely at the institutional dogma represented by Dr. Reed. As Lena focused on the genetic code, Samuel studied the high-resolution photos of the artifact circle on the main monitor. "They did not just throw these things away," he said softly. "Look at the pattern. The English things are on the west side, toward the setting sun, the world they left behind. The gifts of our people are on the east, toward the dawn." He pointed to the broken pipes and shattered pottery. "This is a ceremony of unnaming. When a tribe was facing annihilation, from war or from hunger, the survivors could ask for sanctuary. To be accepted, they had to die a ritual death. They would cast away their names, their tools, their stories, everything that made them who they were. They would become empty vessels, ready to be filled with a new spirit, a new name, a new people." Alistair listened, watching the two threads come together. On one screen, Lena was searching for the physical remnants of a people, the ghostly traces of their genetic code. On the other, Samuel was describing the spiritual mechanism of their disappearance. One was a story of science, the other a story of soul, and both were leading to the same impossible conclusion. While the DNA sequencer ran its slow, methodical process, Alistair knew he was missing the final piece of context, the word, the single clue that had started it all. "Samuel," he said, "I need you to take me to Hatteras." They drove to the coast and took a ferry to the long, windswept barrier island that was once known as Croatoan. Lena stayed behind, guarding the precious data in the van. On the island, Samuel didn't lead Alistair to an archaeological site or a specific landmark. He simply walked with him along the beach, the Atlantic waves crashing on one side, the calm sound on the other. "My ancestors survived here because they understood the water," Samuel said, gesturing to the shifting sands. "They knew when to be near the ocean and when to retreat to the sound. They didn't fight the world, they moved with it. The English built a fort. They tried to command the land, and the land broke them." He led Alistair up a high dune, the highest point on the island, with a panoramic view of the sea and sky. "From here, you can see the whole world," Samuel said. This was a sacred place, a place of beginnings. He turned to Alistair. "You think Croatoan was the name of a place they were going to? A signpost pointing the way? You've been reading it like an Englishman." He paused, letting the sea breeze carry the weight of his next words. "In the oldest dialect of my people, a dialect we no longer speak, the word has a different meaning. It does not mean a place. It means an idea. It means the soul of the new world. Or, more simply, we are reborn here. It wasn't a destination. It was a declaration of faith. It was the title of their final chapter and the first word of their new one." They returned to the van after dark. The small space was thick with tension. Lena was sitting before the sequencer, her face pale, her expression one of utter disbelief. She looked up as they entered, her eyes wide. "I ran the sequence 3 times, she whispered. "I thought it had to be an error, contamination." She pointed a trembling finger at the screen, which was filled with complex genetic charts. "There are multiple mtDNA haplogroups in the soil from the ritual site. As expected, most are consistent with the historical Algonquian-speaking tribes of the area. And yes, there are clear traces of European mitochondrial DNA, haplogroup H, English." "So it proves intermarriage," Alistair said, his mind racing. "It supports the assimilation theory." "No," Lena said, shaking her head. You don't understand. She brought up another screen, a comparison chart. I ran the unique markers from the site against a modern genetic database. There were no hits for the European markers, they were too old and degraded. But the specific combination of the native haplogroups from that 400-year-old site, I found a direct one-to-one match. A match with who? Alistair pressed. Lena turned her chair and looked directly at Samuel Blackwood. Her voice was filled with an awe that finally, completely, shattered her lifelong skepticism. It's a direct match to unique markers found in only a handful of families within the documented Lumbee tribe, she said, including yours, Samuel. The DNA from that ritual is still walking the earth. It's in you. The silence in the van was absolute. Samuel's oral history wasn't just a story. It was a living, biological record of an impossible event. The blood had spoken, and the machines had confirmed every single word. The university lecture hall was a sterile theatre of controlled information. Dr. Evelyn Reed stood at a sleek podium, bathed in the cool light of the projector screen behind her. The room was filled with reporters, cameras, and university faculty, all listening intently as she delivered the official, sanitized narrative of the Roanoke dig site. She spoke with the unassailable confidence of someone who both writes the history and owns the podium. After extensive preliminary analysis, she stated, her voice smooth and authoritative, "Our team has concluded that the site represents a multi-period composite. We have clear evidence of a late 17th century agricultural structure, likely a barn, built atop a pre-existing Native American refuse pit." She clicked a remote, and an image of a few nondescript pottery shards appeared on the screen. The so-called ritual elements are nothing more than a coincidental mixing of these two periods. A trash pit, as I initially surmised, notable only for its unusual state of preservation. She was brilliant in her own way. She had taken their world-altering discovery and repackaged it as a mundane footnote, scientifically plausible and institutionally safe. She was in complete control. At the back of the hall, standing by the heavy oak doors, Alistair, Lena, and Samuel watched her performance. Lena was trembling with a mixture of anger and anxiety. Samuel stood placid and immovable, his gaze fixed on Dr. Reed, his expression one of patient observation. Alistair felt a strange calm settle over him. He wasn't the man who had arrived on this island weeks ago, so sure of his own intellectual superiority. He had been humbled, taught to listen, and now he was ready to speak. Dr. Reed is mistaken. Alistair's voice, though not loud, cut through the room, his quiet hum. All heads turned. Reed stopped mid-sentence, her face tightening with fury as she saw him at the back of the hall. 2 university security guards started moving toward him. "This site is not a trash pit," Alistair continued, walking calmly down the central aisle. "It is a testament." Before security could reach him, Lena, from her position by the AV booth, plugged a laptop into the projection system. The image of Reed's pottery shards vanished, replaced instantly by Alistair's 3D GPR scan of the ritual circle. The reporters gasped. Reed sputtered, "What is the meaning of this? Security, remove him." But it was too late. Alistair had seized the narrative. "For 400 years, we have asked the wrong question," he said, his voice now booming through the hall's sound system. He pointed to the screen. "We asked, where did the colonists go? The land has been telling us all along we should have asked, what did they become?" He laid out his thesis with a passionate, undeniable precision. The GPR scans flashed on the screen, followed by the dendrochronology charts showing the 800-year drought. They weren't lost, they were starving. Both the English and the natives. Faced with annihilation, they didn't fight each other. They came together. He showed the photos of the ritual site, the ceremonial circle of broken English pipes and sacred native shells. He explained Samuel's story of the unnaming the ritual death required to be reborn into a new tribe. "This is baseless speculation," Reed shouted from the podium, her composure cracking. "It is fantasy, not archaeology." Alistair turned to face her directly. "Is it?" he asked. "Science requires falsifiable proof, Dr. Reed. You taught me that. Evidence that cannot be denied." He nodded to Lena. The final slide appeared on the screen. It was a complex chart of mitochondrial DNA sequencing. "This," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a powerful, dramatic hush, "is the DNA signature from the soil at the heart of that 400-year-old ritual. And this, a line shot across the screen, connecting the ancient signature to a modern one, is the DNA of a living man." He gestured to Samuel Blackwood, who now walked to stand beside him at the front of the hall. "The oral history of the Lumbee people, the story you dismissed as folklore, is a living, biological record of this event. Samuel Blackwood is a direct descendant of the people who performed that ritual. His blood proves his story is true." The room was utterly silent. The reporters stared, their cameras forgotten. The faculty members looked from the screen to Samuel, to the speechless woman at the podium. Dr. Reed's authority, her entire worldview, had been dismantled by a single irrefutable piece of data. Alistair turned back to the audience, to the cameras, to the world. "The colonists of Roanoke were never lost," he said, his voice ringing with the clarity of truth. "They were found. They weren't erased by a mystery. They were saved by a new beginning. They didn't write a destination on that post. They wrote their new name, their declaration, their soul." Croatoan. Weeks later, the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow on the Roanoke historic site. The air was calm, peaceful. The tourists were gone for the day. A small work crew was just finishing the installation of a new historical marker. Alistair and Samuel watched from a distance as the workers loaded the old sign, the one that spoke of mystery and disappearance, onto a truck to be hauled away. The new sign was made of bronze. Its text described a settlement caught in a catastrophic drought, and the unprecedented union of two peoples who chose to merge their cultures, their bloodlines, and their destinies in a desperate, hopeful act of rebirth. It told the story not of a lost colony, but of the founding of a new, uniquely American tribe. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, no longer scientists in subject, but colleagues, friends. The quiet hum of the cicadas was the only sound. "What do you think they would have thought?" Alistair asked, his voice soft. "Your ancestors, and mine. Seeing all this, the vans, the labs, the DNA." Samuel smiled faintly, a gentle, knowing expression. He looked from the new sign back toward the ancient forest that bordered the site. "I think," he said, his eyes filled with a timeless wisdom, "they would wonder why it took you so long to learn how to listen." There's something incredibly satisfying about a mystery solved by science. We start with a legend, a piece of folklore like the lost colony of Roanoke, and we expect the archaeologist, Dr. Finch, to be our hero of reason. He's there to sweep away the superstition with hard data, to give us a clean, empirical answer and close the book on the ghost story. But what makes this story so fascinating is that it doesn't do that. Instead, science becomes the unlikely servant of the legend. The DNA sequencer, the pinnacle of modern reason, doesn't debunk Samuel Blackwood's oral history, it validates it. The story kept alive for 400 years, not on paper, but in memory and blood, wasn't a superstition. It was simply a different kind of archive. It forces us to reconsider what we accept as proof. Dr. Finch begins by believing only in data he can measure. By the end, he learns that the most important truths sometimes aren't excavated from the ground, but are listened for in the stories people carry inside them. The story suggests that maybe science and folklore aren't enemies, but are just two different languages trying to tell the same human story. So that leaves me wondering, which do you find more compelling, the scientific certainty of the DNA test, or the profound power of a story kept alive for centuries through memory alone?